The chains burned against Leonor's wrists as they hauled her across the marble floor, her knees scraping stone with each violent pull. The courtiers laughed, their voices echoing off the vaulted ceiling of the throne room like carrion birds circling a corpse. She kept her head down, dark hair falling across her face like a curtain, hiding the silver fire beginning to kindle behind her eyes. They thought this was a joke. They had no idea what they'd awakened. If you've ever felt powerless, if you've ever been underestimated, then you need to hear what happens next. Hit that subscribe button right now because this story is about to shatter everything you thought you knew about strength and destiny. And tell me the city you're watching from so I can send you a hug, because you're going to need it after this journey we're about to take together. The royal court of Valduro had never seen anything like the spectacle they were creating. Lord Sebastião stood at the base of the throne, his perfectly tailored doublet catching the afternoon light streaming through stained glass windows. His smile was cruel, practiced, the smile of a man who had never known consequence. Beside him stood his newly bonded mate, Lady Catarina, her hand possessively wrapped around his arm, her lips curved in satisfaction. She wore Leonor's grandmother's necklace. The silver and moonstone pendant that had been in Leonor's family for 7 generations now hung around the neck of the woman who had stolen everything. But let's go back. Let's go back to understand how Leonor da Silva, youngest daughter of a minor noble house, Omega wolf shifter of unremarkable lineage, ended up being dragged before King Afonso's throne on charges of treason and dark magic. Let's go back to understand why the weakest member of the pack was about to become its greatest threat. 3 months earlier, Leonor had believed in love. Foolish, perhaps, for an Omega in a world where power determined everything, where your rank in the pack hierarchy decided whether you lived in silk or sackcloth, whether you ate at tables or begged for scraps. But Sebastião had been different, or so she thought. He'd sought her out in the gardens of his family's estate, had spoken to her of poetry and stars, had traced the line of her jaw with fingers that trembled with what she believed was genuine feeling. He'd told her that rank meant nothing to him, that he saw her true worth, that when the moon was full and they completed the bonding ceremony, they would run together through the forests as equals. She'd believed every beautiful lie. The truth came like a blade on what should have been the happiest night of her life. The bonding ceremony had been arranged, the entire pack assembled under the full moon. Leonor had worn her mother's dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, the lace yellowed with age but still beautiful. She'd stood in the ceremonial circle, her heart thundering with joy and terror and anticipation, waiting for Sebastião to emerge from the Alpha's hall and complete the ritual that would bind their wolves, their souls, their lives together forever. He'd emerged certainly. But Catarina walked beside him, her hand in his, her dress pristine white and crusted with crystals that caught the moonlight like captured stars. The crowd had gasped. Leonor had stood frozen, unable to process what she was seeing, her mind refusing to accept the betrayal even as it unfolded before her eyes. Sebastião hadn't even looked at her. Not once. He'd completed the bonding ceremony with Catarina right there, in front of everyone, in the circle that had been prepared for him and Leonor. The pack had watched in stunned silence as he spoke the ancient words, as their wolves merged in a flash of golden light that illuminated the night sky. And when it was done, when the bond was sealed and irreversible, only then did he turn to Leonor with that same cruel smile he would wear 3 months later in the throne room. "Did you truly believe," he'd said, his voice carrying across the silent gathering, "that someone like me would bind themselves to a worthless Omega? You were entertainment, Leonor. Diversion. Nothing more." The pack had laughed then too. Not all of them, perhaps. Some had looked away, uncomfortable. But enough had laughed to make it clear that she was alone. The humiliation had been designed, calculated, a public spectacle to establish Sebastião's cruelty and power. To show the pack that he was alpha material, that he could destroy without mercy, that sentiment was weakness he had successfully purged from his character. Leonor had run. Of course she had run. She'd shifted right there in the ceremony circle, her wolf smaller than most, her fur a muddy brown where other wolves gleamed silver and gold and midnight black. She'd run into the forest and hadn't stopped running for 3 days, pushing herself until exhaustion and grief finally pulled her down into unconsciousness beneath the ancient oak tree whose roots cradled her broken body like a mother's arms. When she'd woken, everything had changed. The wolf inside her felt different. Sharper. Older. Like something had cracked open inside her chest and let in light that had been locked away for centuries. Her senses were heightened beyond anything she'd experienced before. She could hear heartbeats from 100 paces away. Could smell the fear on the wind, the lies in people's sweat, the rot beneath beautiful things. And when she looked at her reflection in the stream, her eyes were no longer the muddy brown they'd always been. They were silver. Pure, molten silver like moonlight given form. She'd thought it was the bond breaking. When an omega was rejected after a bonding ceremony had been initiated, the trauma could sometimes trigger strange changes. Usually those changes were harmful, sometimes fatal. The rejected omega's wolf would become unstable, violent, turning on its human half until neither could survive. Leonor had heard stories of omegas who'd gone mad after rejection, had to be hunted down and killed for the safety of the pack. But this didn't feel like madness. This felt like waking up. This felt like remembering something she'd been forced to forget. She'd stayed in the forest for weeks, learning her new body, her new senses, her new strength. 'Cause there was strength now. Her small omega wolf could run faster than she'd ever managed before. Could hunt with precision that shocked her. Could sense things in the earth itself, currents of power that ran through the ground like underground rivers, places where the veil between the spirit world and the physical world grew thin. And she'd begun to remember things. Dreams that weren't dreams. Memories that couldn't be memories because they were from centuries before she was born. She saw a woman who looked like her, standing on a battlefield, her wolf massive and terrifying, silver light pouring from her like water. She saw that same woman being hunted, betrayed, bound with chains made from her own pack's treachery. She saw the woman's power being stolen, divided, locked away in bloodlines that would forget what they carried. Leonor was descended from that woman. From Aria the Silvermane, the last of the ancient omegas, wolves whose power had once balanced the alphas, whose wisdom had guided entire kingdoms. The ancient omegas had been erased from history, systematically hunted and destroyed by alphas who feared their power, who wanted dominance without balance, control without accountability. The few who survived had their powers bound, locked away through blood magic that would pass through generations, waiting for the right combination of trauma and awakening to break the seal. Sebastião's betrayal had broken Leonor's seal. His cruelty had been the key that unlocked 7 centuries of sleeping power. But she'd tried to be careful. She'd returned to civilization slowly, quietly, keeping her head down and her new abilities hidden. She'd found work in a tavern in the lower city, serving drinks to merchants and sailors, listening to gossip, learning the current state of the kingdom while she decided what to do with this power burning in her veins. That's where Catarina had found her. Or rather, that's where Catarina had sent her hunters to find her. Because Sebastião's new mate was not content with merely having stolen Leonor's intended bond. She wanted to ensure that Leonor could never be a threat, never be a reminder of Sebastião's betrayal, never exist as evidence of the casual cruelty at the foundation of their bond. The hunters had come at night, masked and armed with silver weapons designed to subdue shifters. They'd dragged her from her small room above the tavern, had beaten her when she struggled, had bound her with chains inscribed with suppression runes that burned against her skin and dampened her wolf. But the runes were designed for normal wolves, and whatever Leonor was now, she was far from normal. She could feel her power coiled beneath the suppression, waiting, patient as stone, ready to explode the moment the chains weakened. They'd thrown her in the dungeons beneath the royal palace, and that's when things had gotten truly interesting. Because Catarina hadn't just wanted Leonor imprisoned or killed. She'd wanted her destroyed completely, wanted her name blackened beyond redemption. So she'd planted evidence. Dark magic artifacts in Leonor's room at the tavern. Testimony from paid witnesses claiming they'd seen Leonor consorting with practitioners of forbidden arts. Documents, forged but convincing, suggesting Leonor was part of a plot to overthrow King Afonso and destabilize the pack hierarchy. The charges were absurd. Leonor was a nobody, a rejected Omega with no family, no allies, no resources. The idea that she could threaten the throne was laughable. But that was precisely the point. Catarina and Sebastião wanted to bring her before the court as entertainment, as a joke, as a way to demonstrate their power and ruthlessness. They would parade her before the king and the assembled nobility, present the ridiculous evidence, and watch her be condemned to death amid laughter and mockery. The message would be clear to anyone who crossed them or reminded them of their cruelty. This is what happens. This is how little you matter. So here we are, back in the throne room, Leonor's knees scraping marble, the courtiers laughing, Sebastião and Catarina radiating smug satisfaction. The chains burned, yes, but not as much as they should have. Because during her weeks in the dungeon, Leonor had been working on the suppression runes, feeding them tiny threads of her power, letting them grow accustomed to her energy, teaching them to mistake her strength for something they should permit rather than prevent. It was delicate work, the magical equivalent of convincing a lock that you were the key all along. The guards threw her down at the base of the throne steps. Her chin cracked against stone and she tasted blood. The laughter swelled. Someone threw something, a piece of fruit that splattered against her shoulder. The humiliation was designed to be total, absolute, the kind of degradation that broke spirits before the execution broke bodies. King Afonso sat on his throne, looking bored. He was an old wolf, his hair gone silver, his face weathered with decades of politics and pack management. He'd been a strong alpha once, they said, but time and luxury had softened him. Beside him stood his son, Prince Miguel, a young man with sharp features and sharper eyes, watching the proceedings with an expression Leonor couldn't quite read. Not mockery, not pity, something closer to curiosity. Lord Rodrigo, the Master of Justice, stepped forward with an ornate scroll. His voice rang out across the throne room, reading the charges with theatrical flair. Treason, conspiracy, practice of forbidden dark magic, attempted murder of Lady Catarina through supernatural means. The charges were elaborate and ridiculous, supported by evidence so obviously fabricated that Leonor might have laughed if her mouth wasn't full of blood. When Rodrigo finished, King Afonso leaned forward slightly. "Well," he said, his voice tired, "does the accused have anything to say in her defense?" This was it. Her moment to beg, to plead, to grovel and provide the final act of the entertainment. They expected tears. Expected her to throw herself on the king's mercy, to protest her innocence, to make herself even more pathetic before they passed sentence. Leonor lifted her head. Blood dripped from her split lip, but her eyes were clear. Silver eyes that hadn't been silver at her birth. She looked directly at the king, and then she smiled. "I have nothing to say in my defense," she said, her voice steady and clear, carrying across the suddenly silent throne room, "because I recognize no authority in this court to judge me." The silence deepened. Shock rippled through the assembled nobility like wind across water. No one spoke to the king that way. No one, especially not a chained Omega on trial for her life. Sebastião stepped forward, his face flushing with anger. "You dare!" "I dare," Leonor interrupted, still looking at the king, still smiling that strange, terrible smile. "I dare because this entire proceeding is built on lies. I dare because everyone in this room knows the charges are fabricated. I dare because you've forgotten what you destroyed to build your comfortable hierarchy." She paused, and her voice dropped to something like sadness. "You've forgotten what Omegas were. What we are. What I am." Catarina laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "What you are. You're nothing. A rejected, powerless Omega with delusions." The chains shattered. Not broke, shattered, exploding into fragments of metal and dissolved runes with a sound like breaking crystal. The suppression that had been dampening Leonor's wolf evaporated like morning mist under the sun. And the power that had been coiled inside her, patient and waiting, finally unfurled. The first thing that happened was the light. Silver light poured from Leonor's skin like she was made of captured moonlight, so bright that the courtiers cried out and shielded their eyes. The second thing was the temperature drop. Ice crystallized across the marble floor, spreading out from where Leonor stood in fractal patterns of devastating beauty. The third thing was the pressure, a weight of ancient power that pressed down on every shifter in the room, making their wolves cower and whine, making even the strongest alphas feel like children facing something primal and terrible. Leonor rose to her feet, and as she rose, she shifted. But not into the small, muddy brown Omega wolf they all expected. That wolf was gone, burned away in the awakening. The wolf that emerged was massive, easily twice the size of the largest alpha in the room. Her fur was silver, true silver that caught the light and reflected it back multiplied. Her eyes were molten silver, glowing with power that predated the kingdom, predated the current pack structures, predated everything they thought they knew about their world. She was beautiful. She was terrifying. She was everything that had been erased from history, walking back into the present with 7 centuries of anger and grief and power that demanded recognition. The throne room had gone absolutely silent. No one laughed now. No one moved. The ancient Omega stood in the center of the hall, her presence filling the space like a physical force, and every wolf in the room felt their instincts screaming contradictory messages. Threat, power, danger, submit, run, worship, fear. King Afonso had half risen from his throne, his face pale. Prince Miguel had moved in front of his father, his hand on his sword, but Leonor could see the tremor in his arm. He was brave, she'd give him that, but bravery meant nothing in the face of what she'd become. Sebastião had stumbled backward, all his cruel confidence evaporated. Catarina had gone ghost white, her hand at her throat, touching the stolen necklace like it was a lifeline. Both of them finally understood what they'd done. They hadn't just rejected and humiliated an Omega. They'd awakened something that should have stayed sleeping. Leonor shifted back to human form, but the power didn't diminish. She stood naked in the center of the throne room, covered in silver light, and her voice when she spoke carried harmonics that made the windows rattle. "You want to know what I am?" she said, looking at each of them in turn. "I am what you've spent centuries trying to erase. I am the balance you destroyed. I am the Omega power that your ancestors feared so much they rewrote history to pretend we never existed." She turned to Sebastião and Catarina. "And you, in your petty cruelty, broke the binding that kept that power locked away." She walked forward, and the crowd parted before her like water before a ship's prow. Ice followed her footsteps, each print a crystallized reminder of her presence. She stopped in front of Sebastião, who looked like he wanted to run but was too terrified to move. "You thought breaking me would prove your strength," Leonor said softly. "But all you did was free me from the chains your ancestors put on mine. I should thank you. Your betrayal was the greatest gift you could have given me." "Please," Sebastião whispered, and the word was ash in his mouth. "I didn't know. I didn't." "No," Leonor agreed. "You didn't know. None of you knew. That was the point. They buried us so deep in the past that you forgot we existed. Built your entire society on the lie that alphas were the strongest, that omegas were the weakest, that the hierarchy was natural and unchangeable. But it was never natural. It was constructed, enforced, maintained through blood and terror and lies told so often they became truth." She turned to address the entire throne room. "The ancient omegas were the balancers. We held the alphas accountable. We could challenge them, check their power, ensure they led with wisdom instead of just strength. We were the reason the packs thrived, why territories lived in balance instead of constant war. But we were also the reason alphas couldn't become tyrants. And so they destroyed us, hunted us, bound our powers and scattered our bloodlines. Made sure their descendants would never know what they'd lost." Prince Miguel found his voice, though it shook slightly. "If what you say is true, if you truly carry this ancient power, then what do you want? Revenge? The throne? To destroy the pack hierarchy?" Leonor looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something in his eyes that surprised her. Not just fear, not just shock, but understanding, maybe even hope. "I want," she said slowly, "what was stolen from my ancestors. I want recognition. I want the truth to be known. I want the Omega bloodlines awakened and trained, so that balance can be restored before your alpha pride destroys everything. She gestured at the throne room, the opulence, the wealth built on the backs of those deemed lesser. This system is breaking. You can feel it. The packs are unstable. Alphas fight each other for scraps of territory. Resources dwindle because no one remembers how to maintain balance with the land. Omegas are treated as property or jokes because you've forgotten they're the root system that keeps the whole tree alive. King Afonso had sunk back onto his throne, suddenly looking every one of his years. "And what of my rule?" he asked quietly. "What of the kingdom?" "That," Leonor said, "depends on you. I'm not here to overthrow anything. I'm here because you dragged me here, remember?" A hint of bitter humor touched her voice. This was supposed to be my execution, my humiliation. Instead, it becomes the moment everything changes. What happens next is a choice. Your choice. She turned back to Sebastião and Catarina. As for you two, the punishment for what you've done isn't death. It's memory. You'll live long lives, and every day you'll remember this moment. You'll remember how small you are, how your cruelty awakened something you can never control. And you'll watch as the world you thought you understood transforms into something you can't dominate. Catarina's hand went to the necklace again, and Leonor's eyes followed the gesture. In one fluid movement, the necklace was in Leonor's hand, the chain broken, the moonstone pendant warm against her palm. "This," she said quietly, "is mine. Belonged to my grandmother. To her grandmother before her. All the way back to Aria Silvermane herself. You have no right to wear my history." She fastened it around her own neck, and the moonstone blazed with silver light, recognizing its true owner. The moment the clasp closed, Leonor felt another wave of power surge through her, the accumulated strength of all her ancestors flowing into her body like a river finding its course. The pendant wasn't just jewelry. It was a key, a focus, a repository of Omega power that had been waiting for the right descendant to claim it. The throne room floor cracked. Not destructively, but as if roots were pushing up from below, as if something buried was finally breaking free. Leonor could feel it, the other locked bloodlines beginning to stir. Her awakening was sending ripples through the ancient magic that bound the Omega power. Across the kingdom, across the continent, other descendants were probably feeling strange stirrings, their wolves beginning to remember what they'd been bred to forget. The change she represented couldn't be stopped now. The knowledge couldn't be buried again. Too many people had witnessed this moment. By nightfall, the story would be spreading through the city. By dawn, it would be racing across the kingdom. The Omega who shattered her chains in the throne room. The ancient power that returned. The lie at the foundation of their society exposed. King Afonso seemed to understand this. He sat on his throne, an old wolf watching his carefully maintained world crack and transform, and perhaps for the first time in decades, he made a decision based on wisdom instead of political convenience. "Prince Miguel," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion and something that might have been relief. "Bring her robes. She will not stand naked in my court a moment longer." It was a small gesture, but it was acknowledgement, recognition. The first step toward accepting what could no longer be denied. Miguel moved quickly, removing his own ceremonial cloak and approaching Leonor with cautious respect. He held it out to her, his eyes meeting hers, and she saw questions there. So many questions, but also something else. Possibility. She took the cloak and wrapped it around herself. The silver light faded slightly, no longer overwhelming, but still present, still undeniable. She was no longer just Leonor da Silva, rejected Omega, lowest of the low. She was Leonor Silvermane, inheritor of power, breaker of chains, the first ancient Omega to walk openly in 700 years. "Lord Rodrigo," the king said, "you will strike down these charges immediately. And you will begin an investigation into who falsified the evidence. I want everyone involved brought before me." Sebastião and Catarina exchanged panicked looks. their plot unraveling, their mockery transforming into their own condemnation. Rodrigo bowed deeply, his hands shaking slightly as he rolled up the scroll of charges. "As you command, Your Majesty." "Furthermore," Afonso continued, and now his voice grew stronger, as if making this decision was returning some of his old strength, "I declare that the persecution of Omegas ends today. Any laws that treat them as lesser are hereby void. Any practices that exploit or abuse them are now punishable offenses." He looked at Leonor. "We have been living in the shadow of our ancestors' crimes. Perhaps it's time we step into the light and face what we've done." The throne room erupted in whispers, shocked conversations, arguments beginning to spark. Some of the nobles looked relieved, perhaps Omegas themselves or parents of Omega children, finally seeing hope for change. Others looked furious, seeing their privilege and power beginning to slip away. It would be a fight. Laws could be declared, but changing hearts and systems would take time, effort, blood. But it was a start. A crack in the foundation wide enough that light could finally get through. Leonor bowed to the king, a gesture of respect but not submission. "Thank you, Your Majesty. This is more than I expected when they dragged me here in chains." A ghost of a smile touched the old king's face. "Yes, well, I suspect this day has not gone as anyone expected." He paused, studying her with new eyes. "You'll need a place to stay. Resources. Protection probably, from those who won't welcome these changes." "I'll manage," Leonor said. "I've been managing in the lower city just fine." "Nevertheless," Prince Miguel interjected, "my father is right. You're a symbol now, whether you want to be or not. People will be looking for you. Some to learn from you. Others." He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. "Others to silence you. To stop the changes before they spread too far." Leonor considered this. It was true that everything had changed in the last few minutes. She couldn't go back to quiet anonymity, couldn't pretend to be just another powerless Omega trying to survive. She'd made herself visible in the most dramatic way possible, and visibility came with consequences. "I'll accept a place in the palace," she said finally. "Not as a guest, but as a resident with my own authority. I'll need space to work, to research, to find others like me and help them awaken their own power. I'll need access to the royal archives, particularly anything related to the ancient Omegas and the Purge." She looked directly at the king. "And I'll need your protection when I start challenging the old ways, because I will challenge them. Every law, every custom, every assumption built on the lie of Omega weakness. That's going to make me enemies." "It will," Afonso agreed. "But perhaps that's exactly what this kingdom needs. Someone brave enough to shake the foundations and force us to rebuild on truth instead of convenient lies." Over the next hours, as the throne room slowly emptied and shocked nobles scattered to process what they'd witnessed, practical arrangements were made. Leonor was given apartments in the east wing of the palace, rooms that hadn't been occupied in years but were still beautiful, still commanding views of the city and the forests beyond. Miguel personally oversaw the preparations, and she got the sense he was genuinely curious about her, about what she represented, about the changes coming. "May I ask you something?" he said as servants brought fresh clothing and furnishings to her new rooms. "Of course. When you shifted, that wolf, is that what all ancient Omegas looked like? That size, that power?" Leonor considered the question. "I don't know. The memories I've inherited are fragmented, incomplete. But I think we were all different, just as alphas are all different. Some larger, some smaller. Some with one type of gift, some with another. But yes, we were powerful. Had to be, to balance the alphas. You can't check someone's power if you're powerless yourself." Miguel nodded slowly. "It makes sense. The hierarchy never made sense, really. If Omegas were so weak, why did alphas need such elaborate rules to control them? Why so much fear around Omega gatherings, Omega education, Omega autonomy?" He looked at her. "They were afraid of you, are afraid of you, because deep down, they remember what they destroyed. Some remember, Leonor agreed. Most have just absorbed the fear without understanding its source. That's what makes systematic oppression so effective. Eventually, people stop questioning it. It becomes the way things are, natural as breathing, and anyone who challenges it is mad or dangerous or both. You're going to be seen as dangerous, Miguel warned. By a lot of people. Including some in my father's court. I know. But I've already been powerless and despised. I've already been rejected and humiliated and dragged through the streets in chains. Being feared. She smiled slightly. That's at least an upgrade. Over the following weeks, Leonor settled into her new reality. Her presence in the palace sent shockwaves through the kingdom's power structures. Some Omegas sought her out, desperate for answers, for hope, for proof that change was possible. She met with them in secret at first, then more openly as King Afonso's protection held. She taught them to meditate on their wolves, to look for signs of suppressed power, to feel for the bindings that might be keeping their true strength locked away. Not all of them had ancient Omega blood. Most didn't. But all of them benefited from being taught they had value, had strength, had the right to determine their own lives. That alone was revolutionary in a society that had treated them as property for centuries. She also began working with the royal scholars, demanding access to texts that had been locked away, histories that had been edited or destroyed. What she found confirmed her inherited memories and filled in gaps. The ancient Omegas hadn't been destroyed in a single purge but over generations, systematically hunted and eliminated through a coordinated effort by alpha houses who wanted absolute power. The few who survived had their abilities bound through blood magic, with instructions that the binding be renewed in each generation to ensure the power stayed locked. But bindings could break. Trauma could break them. Intense emotional experiences. The right combination of circumstances. Leonor's had broken through rejection and humiliation. Others might break through different paths. And once broken, the power couldn't be locked away again. Not easily. Not without killing the Omega. And even King Afonso's protection wouldn't extend that far if the Omega grew dangerous. So control became education. Understanding. Leonor worked to develop training methods that would help newly awakened Omegas channel their power safely, understand their abilities, integrate them with their human minds. It was work that should have taken years, decades, but she was driven by necessity. More Omegas were awakening every week as word spread, as hope rippled through bloodlines that had been suppressed for centuries. Sebastião and Catarina faced their own consequences. The investigation revealed their plot to frame Leonor, and while King Afonso stopped short of execution, he stripped them of their titles and lands. They were exiled from court, forbidden from using their family names, reduced to common citizens. It was a mercy they probably didn't deserve, but Leonor had advocated for it. Not out of forgiveness, but because she understood that their true punishment was living with what they'd done, watching the world they'd tried to control transform beyond their reach. Sometimes, late at night, Leonor stood on her balcony and looked out over the city. She could feel the change spreading like ripples in water, could sense other Omega bloodlines beginning to stir. The kingdom was transforming whether it wanted to or not. There would be resistance. There would be violence, probably. Change always came with a cost. But there would also be hope. There would be Omegas who didn't have to live in fear. There would be a new generation growing up in a world where your designation didn't determine your value. There would be balance restored slowly and painfully, but restored nonetheless. Prince Miguel visited her often on those evenings. They developed a friendship built on mutual respect and curiosity. He asked endless questions about her abilities, her plans, her vision for the future. She appreciated his genuine interest, his willingness to admit ignorance and learn. He would be king someday, and having a king who understood what Omegas were, what they could be, what they'd suffered, that could make all the difference. "Do you think it will work?" he asked one night, standing beside her on the balcony, watching the moon rise over the city. "The changes. Can you really transform centuries of hierarchy and hate?" "I don't know," Leonor admitted. "But I have to try. Because the alternative is going back to the way things were, and I can't do that. Won't do that. I've seen what we lost when the ancient Omegas were destroyed. The balance, the wisdom, the whole system of checks that kept power from becoming tyranny. We need that back. The kingdom needs that back, even if it doesn't know it yet. You know that some people are calling you the throne breaker? Miguel said with a slight smile. After what you did in the throne room that day. They say you shattered more than just your chains. I shattered the lie, Leonor said simply. The comfortable fiction that let everyone pretend the system was just. That's what broke in the throne room. And yes, I'll break every other lie I find. Every law built on oppression. Every custom that treats people as less than human. I'll break them all if I have to. You'll make powerful enemies. I already have powerful enemies. But I also have something they don't. What's that? Leonor smiled, and her eyes flashed silver in the moonlight. The truth. Time. Because every Omega child born from now on will grow up knowing what was stolen from us. Knowing what we can be. And eventually, there will be enough of us awakened, enough of us strong and trained and ready, that the old hierarchy won't be able to stand. It'll crumble under the weight of its own lies. She touched the moonstone pendant at her throat, felt the power thrumming through it, the connection to all her ancestors who had fought and suffered and died to preserve even a fragment of Omega strength. They'd hidden their power in bloodlines, had bound it away to keep it safe, had waited centuries for the right moment, the right person, the right combination of circumstances to break the seal. She wasn't sure she was the right person. Wasn't sure anyone could be right enough for this task. But she was the person who'd awakened, who'd been dragged before the throne in chains and emerged free. She was the one standing here now, with power burning in her veins and a kingdom full of suppressed bloodlines waiting to be freed. So she would do the work. Would find the other ancient Omega descendants. Would teach them, train them, help them awaken safely and learn to control their abilities. Would build networks and support systems. Would challenge laws and fight battles and probably get herself killed a dozen times over before this was done. But she would do it anyway. Because that's what it meant to be an ancient Omega. Not just power. Not just strength. But responsibility. The responsibility to use that power to protect the powerless. To balance the strong. To ensure that no one ever again had to live through what she'd survived. They'd dragged her to the trial as a joke, thinking she was nothing, no one, a powerless Omega they could humiliate and destroy for entertainment. Instead, they'd awakened something that would reshape their entire world. Sometimes the greatest revolutions began with the smallest acts of cruelty. Sometimes the mightiest forces were born in moments of deepest despair. Leonor had been broken. Had been rejected and humiliated and reduced to nothing in the eyes of everyone who mattered. And from that breaking, from that absolute bottom, she'd risen with power that shattered thrones and rewrote histories. She was the throne breaker, the chain shatterer, the first awakened, the Omega who refused to stay powerless, who looked at centuries of oppression and said no more, who carried in her blood the strength of all those who'd come before and all those who would come after. And this was only the beginning. The kingdom didn't know it yet, but the comfortable order they'd maintained for centuries was already crumbling. The lies were exposed. The truth was spreading. And there was no putting it back in the box, no returning to comfortable ignorance once people knew what had been stolen from them. Leonor stood on her balcony as the moon climbed higher, its light painting the city silver, and she felt the future unfolding before her like a road made of moonbeams and blood. It would be beautiful and terrible. It would cost everything and give back more than she could imagine. And she would walk it anyway, because she'd been given a gift wrapped in betrayal, had been handed power born from humiliation, and she refused to waste it. Below, in the lower city where she'd once served drinks and tried to disappear, a young Omega girl was probably looking at that same moon and wondering if the stories were true. Wondering if someone like Leonor really existed, if change was really possible, if she could dare to hope that her life might be different from her mother's, from her grandmother's, from all the Omega women who'd come before her and learned to make themselves small and quiet and invisible to survive. That girl deserved an answer. They all deserved an answer. And Leonor would give it to them. Not in words but in action. In the world she would build, stone by stone, law by law, heart by heart, until the very foundation of their society had shifted and no one could remember why they'd ever thought Omegas were weak. The months that followed were a whirlwind of activity and conflict. King Afonso's declaration had been a starting point, but laws on paper meant nothing if people didn't follow them. Across the kingdom, Omega abuse continued in places where the old ways were too entrenched, where local alphas had too much power and too little oversight. Leonor heard the stories and burned with helpless rage, because she couldn't be everywhere, couldn't protect everyone, couldn't single-handedly dismantle a system that had centuries of momentum behind it. But she could make examples. When a minor lord in the Northern Territories locked his Omega daughter in a tower for refusing an unwanted bond, Leonor traveled there personally with a contingent of the king's guard. She'd walked into that lord's hall with silver light crackling around her like lightning and demanded the girl's release. The lord had refused, confident in his traditional rights, certain that one Omega, no matter how powerful, couldn't challenge his authority in his own domain. He'd learned differently. Leonor had torn the tower door off its hinges, had carried the terrified girl out in her arms while the lord's guards stood frozen, unable to decide if they should attack this creature of light and fury who wore the king's protection like armor. She'd left the lord with a warning burned into his hall floor in letters 3 feet high. Harm an Omega and answer to the Silvermane. Word spread. Other lords, other alphas who'd been considering testing the new laws, reconsidered. Not all of them. Some were too proud, too convinced of their own superiority, too invested in the old ways to bend. Those ones learned harder lessons. Leonor didn't kill anyone, but she didn't have to. There were fates worse than death for an alpha, and having your power publicly broken by an Omega in front of your entire pack was one of them. Several lords found themselves challenged and defeated by the very Omegas they'd been abusing. Omegas who'd awakened under Leonor's guidance and learned to harness strength they'd been taught to believe they didn't possess. The resistance grew too. Not just from individual alphas but organized. A group calling themselves the Traditionalist Order began actively working against the changes, spreading propaganda, intimidating Omegas who tried to seek Leonor's help, even attempting assassinations. Leonor survived 3 attempts in as many months, each one more sophisticated than the last. The third one nearly succeeded. A silver arrow coated in poison shot from a rooftop while she walked through the market district. It would have hit her heart if Prince Miguel hadn't tackled her out of the way at the last second, taking the arrow in his shoulder instead. She'd carried him back to the palace, her heart hammering with fear and fury, her silver light blazing so bright that people shielded their eyes. The royal physicians worked for hours to extract the poison, and Miguel survived, but barely. He'd saved her life at nearly the cost of his own, and the debt between them transformed into something deeper. Trust, partnership, maybe, eventually, something more, though neither of them had time to explore that possibility with the kingdom tearing itself apart around them. Because it was tearing apart. The changes Leonor represented were forcing every pack, every family, every individual to choose sides. Some embraced the new reality with relief, particularly Omegas and those who'd been sympathetic to their plight. Others fought it viciously, seeing their world and privileges eroding beneath their feet. Minor conflicts erupted into skirmishes. Skirmishes threatened to become battles. The kingdom teetered on the edge of civil war, and Leonor found herself at the center of it all, the symbol everyone pointed to, the figure both sides rallied around or against. She met with Omega councils in secret locations, teaching them to organize, to protect themselves, to build support networks that couldn't be easily destroyed. She advised King Afonso on new laws, new structures that would enshrine Omega rights and create consequences for those who violated them. She trained the newly awakened, helping them master their powers before those powers mastered them, before fear or anger turned them into the monsters the traditionalists claimed they were. And she searched for the others. The other ancient Omega bloodlines, scattered across the kingdom and beyond. Some she found. A fisherwoman in a coastal village who could control water, make the ocean itself rise to her defense. A scholar in the university who could read thoughts, sense lies, see through any deception. A farmer's daughter who could make things grow, turn barren soil fertile, heal sickness in plants and animals and people. Each one she found strengthened the cause, added another pillar to the foundation they were building. But also added another target, another person the traditionalists would try to kill or corrupt or break. Leonor tried to protect them all and knew she was failing, knew that eventually someone would get through her defenses, someone would die because she wasn't fast enough, wasn't strong enough, wasn't everywhere she needed to be. It happened on a cold morning in late autumn. A young Omega named Isabel, barely 16, who'd been awakened 3 weeks earlier and was still learning to control her gift of fire. The traditionalists found her before Leonor could get her to safety, cornered her in her family's home, and in her panic and fear, Isabel's power exploded. She burned the house down, killed herself and 3 of her attackers, and nearly took out the entire block before other Omegas managed to contain the flames. The traditionalists used Isabel's death as propaganda. See, they said, see what happens when you give Omegas power. They're unstable, dangerous, uncontrollable. They'll burn the kingdom down if we let them. The old ways were right. Omegas need to be controlled for everyone's safety. Leonor attended Isabel's funeral and wanted to scream at the injustice of it. The girl had died because she'd been attacked, because she'd been terrified, because she'd been forced into a corner with no way out. Her death wasn't evidence that Omegas were dangerous. It was evidence that the traditionalists were murderers who'd rather kill children than admit the world was changing. But rage wouldn't bring Isabel back, wouldn't protect the others. So Leonor channeled that rage into action, into accelerating the training programs, into pushing harder for legal protections, into hunting down the traditionalist cells and dismantling them one by one. She became relentless, barely sleeping, pushing herself and her power to the limits and beyond. Miguel worried about her. King Afonso worried about her. Even the other awakened Omegas worried about her, seeing her burning herself out in pursuit of a perfect protection she could never achieve. You can't save everyone, Miguel told her one night after she'd returned from another raid on a traditionalist safe house, exhausted and bloodied but victorious. You're trying to carry the entire kingdom on your shoulders, and it's breaking you. If I don't carry it, who will? Leonor asked, too tired to be anything but honest. I'm the first. I'm the strongest. I'm the symbol. If I fall, if I fail, the whole movement could collapse. Or, Miguel said gently, the movement could be stronger than you think, could stand on its own because you've built something real, not just something dependent on one person's strength. He took her hand carefully, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. He didn't. You've awakened dozens of ancient Omegas, trained hundreds of regular Omegas to defend themselves, changed laws, changed hearts, changed the entire conversation about what Omegas are and can be. That doesn't disappear if something happens to you. You've planted seeds, Leonor. Now you need to trust them to grow. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that the work could continue without her, that she'd built something sustainable. But she'd also seen how fragile progress was, how quickly it could be undone by violence and fear. She'd seen Isabel's burned body and knew that every Omega who looked to her for protection, every family that trusted her to keep them safe, was one bad day away from tragedy. Still, Miguel was right that she was burning out. She could feel it in her bones, the exhaustion that didn't lift even after rest, the way her power flickered sometimes instead of flowing smoothly. She was pushing too hard, demanding too much from a body and spirit that needed time to heal, to integrate, to simply be instead of constantly doing. So she made a decision that went against every instinct. She stepped back. Not completely, not abandoning the cause, but delegating more, trusting others to carry parts of the burden. She appointed Council of Awakened Omegas to oversee training programs. She worked with Prince Miguel to create a formal organization within the palace structure. The Omega Guard, sworn to protect Omega rights and answer directly to the crown. She wrote down everything she knew, every technique, every bit of inherited memory, creating texts that could survive her if she didn't survive the struggle ahead. And slowly, painfully, she learned to let go of the belief that she had to be everything to everyone. She was important, yes. Powerful, yes. But the movement was bigger than her now. Had momentum beyond her personal strength. Other leaders were emerging. Other awakened Omegas were finding their voices, their power, their own ways of contributing to the transformation of their society. The winter that year was harsh, and the kingdom weathered it uneasily. There were still conflicts, still violence, but also signs of hope. Several major alpha houses formally recognized Omega rights and began implementing the new laws in their territories. Universities started accepting Omega students without restriction. A few brave Omegas even ran for positions in local governance and won, their voices entering political spaces they'd been excluded from for centuries. Leonor spent that winter in the palace, recovering her strength, deepening her training, and growing closer to Miguel. Their relationship remained officially undefined, both of them too aware of the political implications to rush into anything. A prince and an Omega, especially this Omega, this symbol of revolution and change, their bonding would send shockwaves through every corner of the kingdom. Some would see it as beautiful, a new world made manifest. Others would see it as betrayal, corruption, the royal line tainted by Omega blood. But in the quiet moments between crises, when they sat together in the library or walked through the winter gardens, none of that seemed to matter. He saw her as a person, not just a symbol. She saw him as a partner, not just an ally. And maybe that was enough. Maybe it had to be enough, at least for now, while the kingdom still teetered between old and new, while their enemies still plotted, while the future remained uncertain. Spring came with new challenges. The traditionalist order, wounded but not destroyed, launched a coordinated attack across multiple cities. They targeted awakened Omegas specifically, trying to kill or capture them, trying to prove that Omega power was too dangerous to allow. It was their last desperate gambit, and it almost worked. Dozens of Omegas died before Leonor and the Omega Guard could respond. The violence was staggering, brutal, designed to inspire terror and force King Afonso to reconsider his support for Omega rights. It had the opposite effect. The king, outraged by the death toll and the brazen challenge to his authority, declared the traditionalist order a terrorist organization. He authorized Leonor to hunt them down with any means necessary, gave her command of royal forces, made it clear that this was no longer a cultural debate but an active rebellion that would be crushed without mercy. The campaign that followed was short and vicious. Leonor led her forces across the kingdom, rooting out traditionalist cells, bringing their leaders to justice, and making it clear that the time for tolerance of violence was over. She tried to be merciful where she could, accepting surrenders, offering clemency to those who'd been misled or coerced. But for the true believers, the ones who'd murdered Omegas and laughed about it, who'd burned children alive and called it necessary, for those she showed no mercy at all. By summer, the traditionalist order was broken. Not gone entirely, never truly gone because ideas were harder to kill than people, but broken as an organized force. The surviving members scattered, went underground, or fled the kingdom entirely. The immediate threat was over, and Leonor could finally breathe without constantly looking over her shoulder for assassins. King Afonso held a ceremony in the palace gardens to honor those who'd fallen, both in the traditionalist attacks and in the campaign to stop them. It was a beautiful, sad day, full of grief and pride and recognition of how much had been sacrificed to reach this point. Leonor stood beside the king and Prince Miguel as they read the names of the dead, and she felt the weight of every single one. These were people who'd believed in the cause, who'd trusted her to lead them, who'd died because they dared to imagine a different world. But their deaths hadn't been meaningless. The world they'd fought for was emerging, slowly and imperfectly, but real. Omega children would grow up with opportunities their parents never dreamed of. Omega adults could walk without fear, could pursue education and careers and bonds of their own choosing. The hierarchy that had strangled their potential for centuries was crumbling, and what rose in its place was something closer to justice. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed and evening painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, Miguel found Leonor standing alone by the memorial fountain they dedicated to the fallen. "You did it," he said quietly. "Changed the kingdom. Changed everything." "We did it," Leonor corrected. "Me, you, your father, everyone who fought and bled and died for this. It was never just me." "No," Miguel agreed. But you were the spark, the catalyst, the one who shattered the chains and made everyone else believe it was possible. He paused, then continued with careful deliberation. My father is getting old. He's talking about abdication, wants to retire while he still has the strength to enjoy it. Which means I'll be king soon. Leonor's heart stuttered. Miguel, I'm not asking you to bond with me, he said quickly. I know the political complications, know that it might undermine everything we've built if people think you only have influence because of a royal bond. But I want you to know that when I'm king, you'll have a place at my side if you want it. As advisor, as partner, as whatever you choose to be. The kingdom needs your voice, your wisdom, your strength. I need those things. She looked at him, this man who'd saved her life, who'd fought beside her, who'd believed in the cause even when it cost him blood and nearly cost him his life. She saw in his eyes the same determination she felt, the same commitment to building something better than what they'd inherited. I'll stay, she said. Not because you're going to be king, but because the work isn't finished. Won't be finished in our lifetimes, probably. But I'll stay and keep fighting, keep building, keep trying to make the vision real. That's all I ask, Miguel said, and his smile was warm with relief and something deeper that neither of them was quite ready to name. The years that followed were calmer, though never peaceful. Change continued, gradual and sometimes frustrating but undeniable. More ancient Omega bloodlines were found and awakened. The Omega Guard became a permanent institution, respected and feared, ensuring that Omega rights weren't just words on paper but enforced reality. Universities established whole departments dedicated to studying Omega history, Omega magic, Omega contributions to society that had been erased or credited to alphas. King Afonso abdicated in his 70th year, and Prince Miguel became King Miguel I, the Reform King, the Omega's friend. His coronation was witnessed by thousands, including dozens of awakened Omegas who stood in places of honor, their presence a declaration that the old order was truly dead. Leonor stood beside him that day, not as a bonded mate but as the first Omega counselor, a position created specifically for her, giving her voice and authority without requiring a romantic bond that might complicate both their positions. She wore silver and moonstone, her grandmother's necklace gleaming at her throat, and when she looked out at the crowd, she saw faces that had never existed before. Omega scholars, Omega guards, Omega merchants, Omega politicians, all living lives that would have been impossible a decade earlier. She also saw Sebastião in the crowd, standing far in the back, his face aged beyond his years. He'd been there for every major ceremony, every celebration of change, forced to watch the world he'd tried to dominate transform into something he couldn't control. Their eyes met briefly, and she saw in his expression not hatred but something closer to hollow regret, the understanding that his cruelty had birthed the very revolution that destroyed his way of life. She felt no satisfaction in his suffering, no pleasure in his regret, only a kind of tired acknowledgement that consequences were real, that actions rippled forward in time in ways no one could predict or control. He'd tried to break her and had instead freed her, had tried to prove Omega weakness and had instead revealed Omega strength. His betrayal had been the first domino, and everything that followed, all the changes and struggles and transformations, had flowed from that initial act of casual cruelty. After the coronation, there was a feast that lasted into the night. Leonor made her rounds, speaking with Omega families who'd traveled from across the kingdom to witness this moment, offering encouragement and guidance, listening to stories of progress and remaining challenges. It was exhausting and exhilarating, seeing the impact of all they'd accomplished, understanding how much further there was still to go. Late in the evening, she slipped away to the palace walls, climbing to a tower that overlooked the city and the forests beyond. The moon was full, hanging huge and silver in the sky, and she felt her wolf stirring within her, content and powerful and finally at peace with itself. She heard footsteps on the stairs and knew without turning that it was Miguel. He joined her on the tower, both of them looking out at the kingdom spread below, lights twinkling like fallen stars. "Do you ever think about that day?" he asked. "In the throne room when they dragged you in chains?" "Every day," Leonor admitted. It's the pivot point of my entire life. Everything I was before that moment, everything I've become since, it all hinges on those few minutes when I chose to break free instead of break down. I'm glad you chose breaking free, Miguel said softly. For your sake, yes. But also for the kingdom. For everyone who's been able to build different lives because you refused to accept the limits they tried to put on you. She smiled. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Sebastião hadn't betrayed me. He'd actually bonded with me like he promised. Would I still be living as a minor lord's Omega mate, power locked away, never knowing what I could be? Maybe, Miguel said. Or maybe the power would have found another way to break free. Maybe you were always meant for this, and the path was always going to be hard because the destination was always going to be worth reaching. That's a comforting thought, Leonor said. That there was purpose in the pain. That it meant something beyond just cruelty for cruelty's sake. I think you gave it meaning, Miguel countered. By choosing how to respond. By turning betrayal into revolution. Humiliation into awakening. The pain was real, but what you built from it, that was your choice. Your strength. They stood in comfortable silence as the moon climbed higher and the city gradually settled into sleep. Somewhere out there, Omega families were resting easier than their ancestors had in centuries. Somewhere out there, young Omegas were dreaming of futures they could actually achieve. Somewhere out there, the seeds Leonor had planted were still growing, still spreading, still transforming the landscape one life at a time. She'd been dragged to the throne room as a joke, as entertainment, as a powerless Omega meant to be humiliated and destroyed. Instead, she'd shattered everything. Had broken chains and lies and the comfortable fiction of Omega weakness. Had awakened power that had slept for centuries and used it not for revenge but for revolution, not for personal gain but for collective liberation. The work wasn't finished. Would never be fully finished because every generation would face new challenges, new prejudices, new battles to fight. But the foundation was laid. The truth was known. And there was no going back to the comfortable lies of the past. Leonor Silvermane, the throne breaker, the chain shatterer, the first awakened, stood on the tower and felt the weight of history on her shoulders. But also the hope of the future, bright and burning as the moon above. She'd been rejected, betrayed, humiliated, dragged through the streets and thrown at a king's feet in chains. And from that absolute bottom, she'd risen to reshape a kingdom, to rewrite histories, to prove that the weakest could become the strongest if given the chance and the choice to be more than what others believed them to be. Her story would be told for generations, not just as history but as possibility, as proof that one person, in the right moment with the right choice, could change everything. That power wasn't about dominance but about balance. That strength wasn't about crushing others but about lifting them up. And somewhere, in some future year, another Omega child would hear the story of Leonor Silvermane and believe, truly believe, that they too could be more than the limits placed upon them. Could break the chains that bound them. Could shatter the thrones of oppression and build something better in their place. That child was Leonor's true legacy. Not the laws or the institutions or even the awakened bloodlines, but the simple revolutionary belief that change was possible, that justice could be achieved, that the world could be transformed by those brave enough to try. The moon shone silver above the kingdom, and Leonor stood beneath it, silver light in her eyes and power in her blood, and she was finally, completely, utterly free.